having help from people in writing our histories. I'm not sure exactly which aspect of writing your histories you were wondering about having help from people on, but there's a few ways I look at how people can help us. But what kind of thoughts have you had about how other people come into play when I'm writing my personal history or I'm writing my biography? What's their role?
Quite often I've sat down with my kids and we got talking, and then after a time, I'm busy telling a story that had to do with what we were talking about. And all of a sudden, my son says, "We should have been recording this." And so I've come to the conclusion that sometimes opportunities come up when you're talking with others that you hadn't expected to come up, which is I think that's a good thing, but I think it might even be better to actually schedule times when you can get together and talk. I know that one day my mom has been dead for 15 years. I was driving her up to Boise to her home, and we talked in the car. And she told me how she met Dad. And you know, that's, I recorded that, and I've got that in a section that is for her genealogy, for her personal history. I think that getting together with others, especially if they're going to ask questions. I know that whenever we get together with my brothers, that the conversation ultimately goes up to Stack Rock, where there is a treasure buried that our family knows about, that we don't tell anybody else.
But have you found the treasure? That's the question.
No. One of the uncles went up with his family and they didn't find it either. Oh. At least they didn't admit to it. Yeah. The story is that it's hidden under a spotted rock.
Okay.
My uncle get up there, and he had a metal detector. There's about 20 acres of spotted rocks. So it's hidden.
Yeah. So you talk about people, in your sense, you're talking about people who are, because the questions are asked and you're sharing the story, that's inviting the sharing and the memories to come flowing forth in a story, as opposed to having them give their input on the story that maybe is a shared experience. When I think about being with my sister. In fact, this happened when we were at my dad's funeral, or we gathered for my dad's funeral. We weren't at the funeral. We were in my sister's house, and my younger sister had a completely different recollection of an event in our lives that we had both been at than I did. And I don't know if my recollection changed after that conversation, because her putting ideas in my head made me realize I was wrong, or made me think I was wrong. And so I'm not sure it's always a positive thing for me, but in terms of having someone to discuss it with and making sure that it gets recorded, it's I think obviously it's got to happen, because I think of the times when what you just described has happened, where you're talking to somebody and a story comes up, and all of a sudden you share this story, and then in my case, I forget to write it down. And then I want to go back and remember it, and I don't remember all the detail that I told it with when I was telling it as we were going back and forth and sharing it. So I guess I think about it that way, it seems very positive, but sometimes I think, at least with my siblings, we don't remember stories the same way. And I wonder how that impacts my memory and makes it accurate, more accurate or less accurate as I record it later.
Well, I'm reminded, as you say that, of something that happened sometime after that. We were talking about my father, who was in the Second World War on the USS Yorktown when it was sunk, and what he had to do to make it. Well, we discussed that. I think I've written this down. But the thing that happened as a result of that is I started wondering if there were any records about him being rescued from the water. And while I didn't find anything that talked about his particular rescue, I did find his name on the ship that most of the survivors, and took him back to wherever they took him to, Hawaii, I think. And so his name was on the manifest. And I find that to be tremendously interesting.
Yeah.
And what was more interesting to me is that I hadn't recognized that happened before I was born. Now, is that true? That's probably before mom married him. And so these things are, I think, well, you know, they're part of the history that I want to record. But it was neat being able to find proof because of our conversation.
Yeah.
Of course, going and seeing the movie Midway didn't hurt at all either.
I was actually reminded of this when I've just been working on my aunt's personal history book, and it was interesting as she recorded her stories. I started to think of what I didn't know about her parents, which are my grandparents. What I didn't know about them, what I really didn't know about my dad, with some of her interactions with him that she shared in the book, some of which she had shared with me back at the time of his funeral. But it's interesting as I read her history, it then makes me think of stories about or things about my family that I don't know, and it does cause you to go do that research, and you want to get more detail and understand better those stories because they're part of you. And all of a sudden you realize that there's something you didn't know, or there's things you didn't understand, or maybe things that relate to your life that maybe are similar to some of the things that your ancestors have experienced. And all of a sudden you find out, but that's true. And anyway, I think it all adds to the intrigue of wanting to make sure that you tell your stories. It kind of, if nothing else, it provides encouragement to do a better job.
Well, you know, and I think accuracy is important. It isn't all about my memory. And I think that I think that my memory of things is enhanced by discussing it. Now, how often do I mean, the only people that are interested in my stories are my family. You know, and I can give stories to other people that are germane to our conversation.
Yeah.
And sometimes I think that that talking to other people about things and coming up with a story might make some of the stories more important than they would have been otherwise. I mean, it's now something that was important enough to discuss and made a difference in our conversation. Now, whether it made that person do something different or it made them come up with their own story that made me think something different. And I think that we can determine that some stories have more, I want to say importance, but that's the wrong word.
Relevant.
Some stories are more, relevant to what we're doing than others.
Yeah.
And oftentimes, as I wrote things about my early childhood, some of those things are interesting, but they're not really, really important or relevant. But they're things that I thought were important enough to write down. I don't know. I think that. Well, I'm reminded of the fact that we used to buy Reader Digest condensed books.
Yeah,
I'd read the book, and I wondered what they took out. And I never bothered to go figure it out because I figured that I had read the book now.
Yeah.
So if somebody was to do a condensed book of my personal history, what's important enough to keep? And how do I know that?
So can someone else tell you that? As you share the stories with someone else, does that help you figure out maybe what's more relevant than other things, or does it? I don't know. Is that a positive or a negative when it comes to deciding what's most relevant? If you see what maybe excites someone or what interests someone or what, I don't know.
Or what was important enough to bring up in the conversation? Because how many things are important enough to talk about when you're talking just generally with somebody else? I think what we're doing when we talk to other people is we're selecting from our memories of the events in our life that are germane to the topic we were talking about. And if it was important enough to talk about it with that person, then it might be important enough for me to record.
Yeah.
I think I'm stretching, though, however to say that.
I don't know. I think that's pretty accurate. If it's if it's something that as we share, the things that we share are the things that we find most engaging, most important, most relevant, because that's why we share them. Otherwise, we wouldn't feel a need to. I think one of the things that I just was doing a class for Rememberize, that we were recording an online course in writing your personal history, and one of the things I emphasize in there a lot is having a writing buddy, or not even someone who's writing alongside you with their own stories, but maybe at least someone to bounce stuff off of and do what you're talking about, where you share the story and then kind of gauge the reaction, but also maybe get some feedback or maybe some questions. Because I think sometimes we write a story and it's vague. We kind of hit the top end details, but we don't really, the top end facts, but we don't really get to the detail of the story that makes it interesting. And sometimes someone asking me that question, or a question about it, well, why did you do this? Or why did you think that? Or why did that happen? Gets me more into the details that all of a sudden become a huge part of the fabric of the story and why it's important to me and why I'm sharing it. And I never would have realized that if I was just glossing over the surface of the story and just writing it down. So that interaction is what helps me draw out some of those details that make the story, that provide color and make the story a little more relevant. And because someone else is kind of trying to fill in the gap so that they understand why I did what I did, or why I said what I said, or why that person did that. And by asking me the question, I realize that there's a gap. There's something I'm not including in my story that might be helpful in making it more relevant. That's one of the things I've thought about, is I've thought about how people help the writing process.
Well, oftentimes when I'm with somebody else talking about things, they're telling me their stories, I'm telling them mine, and they launch off each other like tears in a ladder. But they're not just my ladder, they're his ladder too, or the other person's ladder. And so you get several of us together and we bounce back, and that reminds me of, and this whole conversation reminds me of that I have been looking out and finding lists of questions. People have written tremendous lists of questions you can ask yourself. And I look at those questions and I think, gee whiz, I don't want to go through all that.
Yeah. But someone you engage with in a conversation about your specific story, you get your specific story questions, as opposed to generally worded questions that you're trying to answer and fit into a narrative.
Yeah, maybe that's what I feel, because most of these lists of questions leave me cold.
Yeah.
Because they're so general, they don't apply to me sometimes.
Yeah.
At least that's what I think.
Yeah.
Although somebody like you, when you came to our home, you were able to ask questions we would give you an answer, and then you could then ask a question that was germane to that answer.
And helped you bring out more, that's what I was talking about, more specifics in the story, because it's focusing specific on the story that you're telling and looking for more detail or more information that I, as a reader, as a listener, don't have, because I didn't experience the story. So I can't just apply the prior knowledge that I have of the situation. I need you to tell me I need you to give me that knowledge to help me understand the story. So that's why I would ask the question, which is where I think a lot of the back and forth can happen as we share our stories with other people and get their input. Paul, how does peer review, it's like kind of like peer review, is it? When you do like writing, or do they not, I mean, to help get more details into what they're writing? Is it, no?
Peer review, we're looking for validity of arguments. Well, and if there's anything left out. So yeah, there might be some important details left out that we would point out in peer review. In fact, that is a lot of what happens, but we're also looking for validity of the information. And questioning, why did you do that? And why did you, why are you making these kind of decisions in your research, and why was that important? So yeah, maybe it is leaving out, drilling down into some more details.
I mean, I just think about that. Seems like maybe my sister was doing peer review when she was telling me the story was different than what I was saying. she was fact checking me. Based on her version of the
yeah, right. We all have a different version, I think, of a Dick Van Dyke show where Laura and Dick had an argument, and she tells her side, and then we see his side, and then there's a fish in the fishbowl in the room, and then it's the fish that kind of has the non-biased opinion. And I think that's true of all of our stories. It just because of perspective, for one thing. But sometimes the details make, we can fabulate some details, because just to make the story a little more cohesive.
Yeah.
So it's possible that my sister does that. And my other sister swears that she does that. And I would agree with her. But I think we all have different perspectives, which is why you get different stories. And that's another fun thing about having the discussion with somebody who was there, not to validate the events, but to add a different perspective to the events, which is cool. But sometimes you have different versions. I mean, just Kurt has this one family story about Jens Jorgensen, and how he had this miracle happen in a stampede of buffalo while he was crossing the plains. And it turns out, so we printed up the story, and we're so excited about it. And Kurt was sharing this at a conference, and somebody in his family line said, "Hey, that's my family story too," but it's a slightly different version. And so what was really cool was that they were able to make another version of it where she is providing alternate versions of the story that have been handed down through the family, different lines of the family. Sometimes you don't know what's true, what's not, and sometimes you just have different perspectives.
Yeah. I think one of the things involving other people does, I've seen this recently actually with things I've done, is sometimes if I'm committed to writing my personal history, but not really committed enough, I know I want to do it, but I'm not all in, so I'm not doing it. Sometimes it's helpful to have someone else involved in the process who's there to remind me, hey, weren't you going to send me something this week from your personal history that I was going to review and kind of give you some feedback on? Or weren't we going to chat about that story this week? So kind of keeps me on track and gives me that little bit of that nudge to try. We had the one client from Las Vegas, that nudge was coming from heaven and from her parents who had passed away. And she said it took her 3 or 4 years before she finally just couldn't handle the nudge anymore. And she just started writing. and devoted herself to the project. I think sometimes that the people, even that's all they accomplish for us, is to give us that nudge to really to keep going or to start going and to start sharing the stories. But and then once we're working on them, as we run them by people and discuss them with them, they do help our, I mean, for all I know, my sister, in fact, her version of the story I'm talking about was actually probably a little more accurate than mine. Because as I recall it now, I recall more her version than mine. And like I said, I try to wonder if I'm remembering it because that's what she said, or if that's what happened. But I think it feels like that's more what happened. And my perspective was different than hers. And I was seeing the story differently. At the time, it was about when my mother was diagnosed with cancer and about our family cross-country trip and some of the things that happened. And it was a different look at what had happened. And it's very possible that I had a personal take on the event that maybe wasn't as accurate as it could have been.
Well, one thing I found is that in our family, each of us has unique skills. And I was trying to remember what our address was when I was baptized in 55, 56. And so I asked my brother, 2 years younger, and he knew exactly the address of that house we lived in. And I was just literally amazed that he remembered that. He remembers that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And so I can rely upon that ability that he has that I don't have for certain facts. I'll bet you we could sit down together and he could tell me every phone number we ever had. Now,
Wow.
I don't know if that's anything to have. I know I sat down and wrote down every place I've lived, and then if I needed an address, I knew where to get it.
Yeah. Yeah, I think my older sister is the one with the facts. She kept most of the hard copy of the stuff, and she remembers the dates and the times for a lot of stuff that for me just happened. And it was kind of around then. And she could actually tell me the actual date just off the top of her head because she's spent more time in that information. So she's usually the one I ask if I'm trying to confirm a date or a time or a place or something, if it's about our family.
We're each traversing a separate individual path. And sometimes the other viewpoint of the environment in which things happen is better understood by somebody else than us.
Yeah.
And that might be something, because as I tell a story, I don't have the world view of what was happening at the time. I mean, when I was a kid, I was just a kid. What did I know? I didn't know anything. I do remember one day going out to the road to see an ex-president go by. Eisenhower drove by, I think. And I told my mom, I went out to see Eisenhower go by. And she said, why didn't you tell me? I wanted to see him too. I think that was Eisenhower. That would have been in 62.
I think everybody's perspectives on events are relevant and interesting. I mean, it's kind of fun to hear everybody talk about, well, what were you doing when JFK was shot, or what were you doing when the towers were, on the day as you watched the towers be demolished, people flying into them. I remember going to see a lecture. Ruby Ridges was at BYU. She is the young girl depicted in a Norman Rockwell painting. She during the time of desegregation. So she was in the painting. it's her in this cute little dress, and then you can see these legs of men in suits. So those are the marshals who were escorting her into her desegregated school, and she had to have an escort because the next thing they showed was actual newsreel. So so we see she started off the lecture, by we saw the picture was hanging, the Rockwell was hanging there in the BYU Museum of Art, but she started the lecture with actual newsreel, and it shows her getting out of a car with marshals and being escorted in, and there were interviews of people who were just saying the most atrocious things about this little 6-year-old, and people throwing stuff, and it was just so hate-filled and just heart-wrenching. And so she said, the film ended, and she says, people always ask me, what, so you see that, what was going through your mind as you were being escorted into this school, or as you watched this video? What's going through your mind as you watch this video, of this historic event, and you're this child, that's the poster child of desegregation? She's like, honestly, what was going through my head was, how could my mom put me in that dress? But then she tells the whole story of what her little 6-year-old brain was going through when she thought she was some kind of royalty. Seriously, the way she tells the story, she thought she had to be tested. She had to go, and she passed these different bars, and these men in suits came to pick her up. She seriously thought that and there was this parade, and she didn't know what the people were yelling. She just heard people yelling. And she didn't hear how hate-filled it was, but she thought she was in some kind of parade. And it's just so interesting to hear this little, her 6-year-old version of the story. So I think everybody's perspective to a story is really interesting.
Yeah, that's a great story. Thanks.
Yeah, I'm grateful she shared it with us.
As I've been thinking about your question, Robin, this week, we're kind of past when I would normally stop this, but I actually thought about the role of an editor in the writing business. I guess I always perceived when I was young that editors were the people who fixed the typos and made sure you used the right punctuation. And that was what the editor did. And I've discovered, I'm not as good at this as I should be, but I've discovered that the best editors are the ones who come back and ask questions about what they didn't understand when they read the manuscript, whatever it is. What wasn't clear? What background do they need to make the story more relevant? Not because, as I said, when I write, sometimes I gloss over and get the facts, but the detail's not there as it should be. And when someone else reads it, and I say an editor because an editor could be anyone who's reading it or with whom you're sharing the story verbally, they're the ones who didn't experience it, or maybe they did differently from a different perspective. But whatever, they aren't in my brain experiencing it like I did. And then they're the ones who are left to say, well, that's a really great story, but why are you telling me that? Or what does that have to do with what we were talking about? Or how did you get in that situation? Because I didn't provide some of the details that show why that was important to me and what's the relevance of this. And that's what I found as an editor, what I wish I was better at, and what good editors do well, in addition to fixing grammar and punctuation, is help us to be better at telling the story. And I think that's what you get when you bring someone else into the writing process. You get someone who maybe critically questions you, or maybe just asks about something that you didn't explain very well. And then the story becomes better because of that. Not that the story changes, but that the way it's told changes.
Well, I was thinking that just a little bit before you said it better than I would have. But the thing I was pondering was, sometimes we transition from one thing to another without proper, the transition isn't explained. And that's what you're saying.
Yeah.
There's something missing that takes me from here to there. And that's what I'm hearing, what you're saying.
Yeah.
And in my mind, I didn't need that transition.
But someone else who's going to read the story will, because
That's right.
they need to get from here to there, and they're not sure how you got there. And if someone's already asked you that question before you wrote it down, and especially in my case, if you printed it, if someone's already asked that question and I filled in that gap, now that written story becomes more powerful and more relevant because the gaps are filled and those transitions are made, and the relevance becomes better. And especially with this, Paula sharing that story, I mean, to get her story of why did my mom put me in the dress, that's hilarious. I mean, you're getting her feelings and some of the things about the experience that she wouldn't normally share if she's just narrating off the story and what happened. But you're getting, someone's asking her a question and she's getting to the feelings of the event that are providing that provides some color, some levity, some value to the story, because it makes it really interesting and fun. That see, you're thinking that's what was on her mind, and you're thinking about the fact that she was 6.
And that, I mean, I don't want to, there was levity and fun in her story, but there was also some very sad, some very ugliness of American history in her story as well. Just, and again, the way she was treated, even as a little 6-year-old, by adults and other children. It's so, but to have her perspective was huge. We have this Rockwell painting, and then just this story that goes along with it is just huge, and another wonderful piece of, not wonderful, but another piece of Americana that we all shouldn't be aware of.
You get the full swing of emotion when you get the light moment and in a very serious moment, and you get inside her brain and realize that she was 6 and she was experiencing this as a 6-year-old. And so you've got this dramatic story from American history that's a sad tale, really. And you're getting interjected into that, what it was like to be the 6-year-old girl that was experiencing it, and how that moment was bigger, so much bigger than what she really experienced that day. But now she really understands it, and she can share the historical impact along with the reality of how she experienced it. And you put those two things together, I just think it makes a powerful, powerful story.
Yep. And that was her point ultimately, is that she was the instrument, and she was happy to be the instrument to make, to bring awareness.
Yeah.
So, and we never know when we can be that instrument. It might just be something trivial, like a cross-country trip and something that happened with your mom, but it may not be trivial as you think.
Yeah.
I mean, anything that anybody writes about these days, where we're in the middle of a pandemic, right? We've got all these different perspectives of what's going on. We're all, stuck at home and doing things on the computer, and, instead of in person. I think anything that any of us share right now is historical. The little kids, and how kindergarten has changed, and now their teacher can literally mute them, and the mothers going nuts with their kids at home, or just these families spending time together. Anything that we write now, I think will be very historic.
Yeah. Maybe. And especially then you put on top of that the racial tensions in the country that are happening. Right. But one of the things that I found very instructive is we think we know, but we don't know. Mm-hmm. Because I know people who are people of color who've experienced things. I know them as these bubbly, positive people who seem like they're like me. And then they tell their story about their life and the things they experienced, that you just think, how could people possibly treat them that way? He's a great guy. How would you treat him that way? And we start to see a picture of life that's different than the bubble we live in. And it helps us to appreciate that everyone's experiencing life differently. And I think that's one of the powerful things about personal histories and stories is we can sit down and read about and learn about how someone else experienced 9/11. That's one of the questions I ask when we do that course and other things I've done is have them write down, where were you? What were you doing when the planes crashed into the towers? And a great idea with that is to share that with someone who was with you or you think was with you and see if their memory of what happened there, it matches yours, because it probably doesn't. Because the emotions of the moment change the way we perceive the event. And so when I think again about the question of the day, which is how do other people impact our stories, I think it's immense. They can help us be better storytellers and share more relevant facts about our stories and really draw out those moments that provide that better detail that makes the story more interesting for someone to read. I wish I'd been there with the lady in the pad, just to experience that. Someone telling the story and you get the broad range of emotion that happened is, to me, a powerful thing. And Robin, you experience that when you tell your stories to your kids. You get the chance to interact, or your family members, and interact and get the give and take that brings out the greater detail.
Well, yeah. I also, when we served the mission in Alabama, we were assigned to an inner city branch. And thinking about it now, if I told a story about my youth, it wouldn't have been, their experiences were so much different than mine.
Yeah.
But I found, and that's one of the things that I think we're missing today. I found that I loved those people because of what they were and what they said. And I hope that they loved me because of what I was and what I said. And they acted that way.
Yeah.
So that was good. But I do think that it's important to have other people's opinions sometimes to guide us and lead us.
Yeah. Excellent. Well, we've gone way over my normally scheduled time, so I don't want to keep you all night. I appreciate the sharing.
I do have another set of questions if you want another topic.
You can do. I'm gonna do this every other week for a little while. So, whoa, did I lose you?
No.
Okay. My screen just went weird. Yeah, I'm gonna do this every other week. So I'm gonna skip next week. We'll do the following week. But what questions you got? You want to share them now, or you want to send them to me?
Well, let me just say, I'm interested in the role of technology.
That's a great question.
Because we've been doing, well, just like we're doing right now.
Yeah.
You know, and can it replace being there and touching, pressing the flesh? And then, of course, there's the idea of remembering what you see. And then the need for recording the experiences, because my mind isn't sharp enough to remember everything.
Those are two very good topics. We'll put those down. So 2 weeks from tonight, we'll do one of those, and we'll do the next one 2 weeks after that.